All right, I am so excited to continue our Beyond the Pharmacy series with my dear friend Monica Acosta. She is in Augusta, Georgia. We are going to specifically today talk about the benefits of yoga and centered around those who are suffering from PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. She has done a lot of work in this area, actually owns her own yoga studio. So with that, I want to give it over to her so she can talk a little bit more about herself and her studio. Monica, I'm so glad you're here with us.
Hi, I'm so glad to be here. So you said a little bit about what I'm doing here. I own a yoga studio. It's called Space Yoga Studio. It's a donation-based studio because here, yoga in Augusta, Georgia, yoga was kind of like a new thing. It's, been real popular elsewhere, but we're a little bit late on that train. So we do a lot of work in the community around Augusta, and it really has kind of been the stronghold of the studio, bringing awareness to what yoga can do as far as being a healing modality, as opposed to just, people like out hugging trees and stuff like that. So, which is, I think, in a real conservative, small town, what people are kind of afraid of. Like, what are these yoga people doing? So it's really opened a lot of possibilities for us. And we do work definitely with people with PTSD. We do work with cancer patients and survivors. We do work with people struggling with addiction recovery, with children, underserved populations, really all over Augusta, Georgia. So that's pretty much what we do in the studio.
I think that's so amazing. And that's why I really wanted to bring you on, because I know how active you are in the community. And being that it's a donation-based studio, you really are seeing a large variety and diversity of people. And that's really allowing you to reach out to those who maybe didn't know the benefits of yoga and didn't even, and like you said, in a much smaller, and years ago, that's kind of what it was, is we all kind of thought of yoga as like, what the hippies do or whatever. And it's really so much more beyond that. And so you're bringing that knowledge to the forefront, which I think is just so great. So I just want to highlight, for those who are watching, maybe don't know what PTSD, or maybe think they know, but they're not quite sure, post-traumatic stress disorder really isn't limited to, a population that maybe a lot of you think of, which is, the military, because clearly they do have, they're exposed to a lot that can result in PTSD, but it really is just a mental health condition or chronic anxiety that can result from a very traumatic event. So that can be a really bad car accident, or it can be sexual trauma as a kid. It can really be it can even be natural disasters. So really this is a much larger population than I think a lot of people may realize. And it's somewhere around 10% of the population in females and 5% in males. So it's quite a large amount of people that we're impacting, and bringing to the forefront what yoga can do is, I think, is a really great topic to have. So can you talk a little bit about how you got involved from kind of getting interested in yoga and opening up a studio to realizing the benefit you could have beyond it just being a fitness studio?
Yeah, sure. So, I think yoga for me it's been a real journey. It's changed a lot in my own life. It's changed my perspective on the world. I also am a sufferer of complex PTSD. It's been part of my life story since I was a child, really. I have a lot of trauma in my background, and I started to notice as I was practicing that things in my life were shifting. My awareness was shifting, the way that I was perceiving the world around me, the way that I was relating to the world around me. And I thought, well, there's got to be something here, like I went into a traditional studio setting where it was just, a generic yoga class, and through my own personal practice started to notice things changing, and thought, because I'm a researcher, I'm an academic, and I was very curious about this, and started to come into contact with people and programs that were running these types of yoga for PTSD. And I think from there, it really got a life of its own. It kind of took off in its own way. I started meeting people who really needed that service, and I started taking training so I could really provide that service. Because the thing about it is, it's very easy to say yoga has all these benefits for PTSD. It's not so easy to find someone who's properly trained to really handle the complexities of that. So it became very important to me to make sure that if I was going to be offering this as, an option for healing, or even as an option for gaining awareness about what exactly is happening in the mind-body system, that I was properly trained, and that I had the tools in my toolbox to offer, that stuff to people. So it kind of just got a life of its own, and it's been a real blessing for us here in Augusta. And it's really, I think, inspired a lot of people to kind of come into the studio to give something that in this area has been marginalized. It's given them an opportunity to like kind of open up to it a little bit. So
that's great. And do you feel like people are being a little bit more aware of it, or more open to seek that option? Because the word, I mean, it's being talked about, it's being, there's options to resources to help them. And so are you finding that as your years of studio opening have moved forward, are you getting more people kind of, approaching you about yoga beyond its just benefits health-wise, but also maybe mental health-wise?
Yeah, absolutely. We definitely have seen an increase in, I think our first program where we weren't just in a traditional studio setting was in a recovery facility. And when they approached me about it, they said, we're really going outside the box here. We've read about the benefits. But once that program started and they started seeing the benefits, we then had the support of that facility. And that facility is tied to Augusta University, which is a large university here. It has a medical college. And so once we had that support, it made it a little bit easier to start, making contact with other facilities and other people who really were starting to see it as a valid form of healing. And of course, like I said, it takes a certain type of training and a specific type of awareness to really work with that. So I encourage all of my instructors, I encourage all of the people in the yoga world to really research those avenues, to really go out there and not just show up and say, hey, let's do yoga in this very generic sense, but to say, here are the specific things that yoga can do to support you in your healing. We're not physicians. We can't give diagnoses. We can't do anything like this, but we can say, hey, what are you struggling with? And what can we offer you that maybe is a little bit off the beaten path, but what can we offer you that can serve you towards, your own personal healing? So.
Right. And that's interesting. I didn't realize that was kind of your beginnings and where you started. And that experience really is now so much more valuable to the community as a whole because you've got that experience. I was going to just bring in a quote, just kind of doing a little bit of research. This is definitely not obviously my specific field, but I was looking up a few, people who are in this world. A Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, I guess, is somebody who's very kind of prominent in this field. And so I'm just going to kind of use this quote and then have you kind of expand on that, on your experience with, specifically your experience with people suffering from PTSD, how you incorporate yoga with them. So, is it that you do just them in groups, or do they, to people who are suffering from that, like mainstream into your regular sessions? And what kind of is your recommendation on going? So let me just go through an excerpt from Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. I love this. He says, what most people do not realize is that trauma is not the story of something awful that happened in the past, but the residue of imprints left behind in people's sensory and hormonal systems. People with PTSD lose their way in the world. Their bodies continue to live in an internal environment of the trauma. So, and then he kind of went into how yoga benefits. And so I would love for you to kind of take that on and move us into, kind of how logistically it works for somebody who, again, are they mainstreamed into, regular classes? Do you have separate classes? Do they do only certain types of yoga that's beneficial for PTSD? So some of the logistics around that.
Yeah, sure. So Dr. Bessel van der Kolk is kind of the leading guy in this whole concept of yoga for PTSD. He's a huge name. He has a great book that came out, I think, last year called The Body Keeps the Score. And it's absolutely profound. It's very relatable. So someone who maybe is just interested in it and doesn't want to go through all of the academic language, it's a really good book to make it like a concrete thing in everyday life. So the concept, to keep it really short, because this is such a huge topic, it could go on forever, but I think the general idea is that being in a state of PTSD is essentially being stuck in the sympathetic nervous system, which means that the body is constantly ready to either do a fight or flight. It's in that mode. And what we do in yoga, specifically through breath work, through postural work, and even sometimes through mantra, depends on the person. What we do is we start to regulate that system. So in a healthy individual, there's a regulation that happens between the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. And what this means is when it's time to fight, you can fight. When it's time to sleep, you can sleep. someone in a state of PTSD really never moves into the parasympathetic nervous system. So they stay in the sympathetic, meaning they're always ready to fight. So they may deal with sleep issues. They may deal with anxiety, everything that would be related to a high level of adrenaline, a high level of nervous energy just constantly running throughout the body. And so what we do is we try to take them away from that dysregulated space into a more regulated space of, okay, a lot of what we do in our lives is choices. We have a choice. If I said to you, hey, let's get angry right now, right? We could change our body physiology in a way that would make us feel angry. We could make fists with our hands. We could grit our teeth, things that eventually would trigger in our mind, wow, my body feels angry, so I must be angry. And then we'd start inevitably thinking about things that would make us angry. And so it kind of works in the opposite direction as well. Instead of being in that space, which for many of these people that are suffering with PTSD, they aren't even really aware that they're in that space, which is why triggers happen and have such a snowball effect, So we take them out of that space and we say, hey, let's bring it over here. Let's do some breath work. Let's do some softening in the body. Let's do some opening in the body. And eventually the parasympathetic nervous system starts to kick in. So, depending on the level, it's kind of an interesting little irony because a lot of these people who suffer with PTSD who maybe are unaware of it, like you mentioned, it being related to the military. And those in the military are very aware of this. But in the general population, a lot of people are walking around with PTSD and have never been truly diagnosed or have never had the ability, maybe the financial means to really explore what's going on. So they aren't aware that this is what's happening in their life. And they come into, the irony is that they're always here, kind of in that nervous system. So they're automatically drawn to power classes, to hot classes, to very intense things because that's where their nervous system feels comfortable.
Okay.
So we're trying to work with them to take them out of that sort of pattern of a high level of fight or flight to start to regulate the nervous system. And, over time with practice, it's a choice. They say, okay, at the end of every yoga class, we take what's called Shavasana. It's corpse pose. We lie there and we do nothing. It's very difficult for people with PTSD because it is a silent space of stillness.
Right.
And we say, hey, every time that you make the choice to be in this space, you have another opportunity to make this choice in a time that isn't a yoga class, right? So you can move into that space whenever you choose to. And eventually, as they're building those new pathways in the brain, as their brains are starting to understand, hey, this is a choice, that nervous system starts to regulate. So, it depends on the person. I think someone who's aware of their PTSD is probably better off working on an individual basis with somebody, eventually moving into a class setting. Of course, we want to normalize them. We want to get them into the everyday society. So we want to move into group classes, but maybe that isn't the best place to start.
Okay.
Yeah, but someone else, who is unaware maybe just needs a little bit of coaching to kind of get to the place or find the group class that works best for them.
Okay. Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective as to what they tend to, gravitate towards, the types of yoga they gravitate towards, and how you guys work with getting them into other options that may be more beneficial for them from a mental health standpoint. So that's a really interesting perspective. So what I would like to kind of go over now is what maybe if you have either a few anecdotes or a generalizable idea of somebody who's maybe started, where they've started, obviously without naming them or identifying them, but where they might have started and what you have seen or your staff members have seen as a transformation, and how maybe what timeline that looks like, and and so what. Bring maybe a story to the forefront, if you can, of an example of what you've seen in the studio.
Sure. Yeah. So the first thing that comes to my mind is a woman who's been practicing at Space now for about 3 years. And when she entered the studio, she had come actually out of a treatment program at Fort Gordon, which is the military base here in Augusta, which actually is the first military base to incorporate yoga in their chronic pain treatment. So it's a very kind of revolutionary thing that they're doing there. And she, as part of her treatment, she was injured and had chronic pain, was on bed rest for like 2 years or something. And they really kind of ran out of options for her. And they moved her into the yoga program, which was a 6-week program. when it was over, she had, I guess, recognized so many benefits of it that she wanted to continue her yoga practice, but couldn't do it there on base. So she joined us at the studio. When I first met her, she was very quiet. She had very strong, firm boundaries. That's really common of people with PTSD, that I think maybe it's related to like being unaware of when a trigger might happen. There becomes like a very firm, strong wall around these individuals because it's more protected. It's a safer space. Mm-hmm. And it takes a little bit of time to kind of break down those walls and understand that the world is safe if we choose for it to be safe. You know, we decide who's allowed in and who isn't, and we have to be able to regulate that in our own lives. So when she first came to the studio, she was very, very quiet, very reserved, you know, didn't really talk much, kind of kept to herself a little bit. And then over time, you know, you really can see the transformation. You really can. You know, she became more personable. She started to relate to other people. When she first came into the studio, probably the most prominent thing that I can remember is that her mat space was very sacred to her. It was like, this is my mat. Don't put your feet next to it. You know, be careful walking around it. And if you think of someone dealing with PTSD, it's like, do you really want a person without, you know, warning coming up behind you? You don't know where people are. She would take the final resting pose with her eyes open because that gave her a greater level of awareness about what was going on. And over time, I've seen her soften into the practice a little bit, you know, and it's not just the practice in the studio. It's the way she relates to people in her everyday life. Right. It's her ability to be open to new relationships, her ability to not be reactive. I think that's primary, actually, to understand that everyone's not out there with a bad intention, or that everything isn't going to hurt you, you know? And she's still practicing with us now. She's actually in our teacher training program, learning how to teach yoga. Yeah. So she can bring it to people with some similar issues and struggles, you know, as she has. So that's probably the first most prominent, I think, story that I can think of. And she's now been a member of Space for about 3.5 years. And comes steadily to her practice. You know, it's a real big part of her life. It's very important to her. So. Wow.
And what a wealth of experience to bring to her future clients. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's just, you know, she can bring that story and understand people from where they're at, just from where she was at. So that's just, that's going to be such a huge individual transformation that then translates into, you know, probably numerous amounts of people that she'll be impacting. That's great. I really do love that. And what do you see kind of as, just to kind of wrap up, what do you see moving forward? Do you kind of feel like as you have evolved in your own yoga studio and you've seen staff and you've seen people just like the girl that you mentioned transform, do you feel like we'll get to a point where maybe, because right now medical guidelines really don't include, you know, and the American Psychological Association pretty much has psychotherapy and antidepressants as the guidelines. So do you feel like we're moving enough towards a place where yoga may be something that would be even in a medical guideline? Do you feel like enough medical personnel, because you have worked, I know, a little bit with that too, on location, like you mentioned, in hospitals and facilities. Do you feel like it's catching on enough in the medical community where this may eventually get into, say, a guideline?
Yeah. I'm hoping we're definitely moving in that direction, I think. And I know that there are some insurance plans that will let you use like your health savings account to cover yoga classes. I think part of the issue is that traditionally in the Western world, yoga has been kind of a deregulated industry. Mm-hmm. There haven't, you know, it's not really, especially being an academic myself, I know about academic guidelines and all of these things that are really not present in the yoga world. So there's been kind of a gap, I guess, in wealth of knowledge of instructors or wealth of experience of instructors. And then the general population, particularly like insurance companies, you know, hospitals, physicians, wanting to accept that what we're doing is valid. And until those things are married, really, until there's like an overlap, we're getting there. I think we're definitely getting there. I think the more information that the instructors can have under their belts, the more sensitive we can be to different populations that really need this modality. And honestly, the more professional we can be in what we're doing and how we're managing our classes, how we're presenting the information, it'll be a lot easier to move in that direction. So we're getting there. We have a long way to go, but you know, I'm over here actively working to make it happen because I believe in it. You know, it's changed my life. It's changed the life of so many people or the lives of so many people that I know. And I think that we constantly see situations where people are given medical treatment, they're given, medicine upon medicine upon medicine, and it's really not serving them. It's actually creating more issues in their life because, like let's say someone goes in for a particular illness and they get a medication, which is then gonna give them depression or anxiety. Then they're coming to the yoga studio trying to find out if they can use yoga to reduce their depression and anxiety. And so it's kind of like a chicken and the egg question. If we can get to them before the medicine becomes an issue, which I do believe is possible, then we don't have to be working retroactively. We can bring that into the forefront of what we're doing and not in the back end, hoping that everything gets better. So.
Right. Well, you're just amazing, Monica. You've been amazing since I've known you well before yoga, and you continue to amaze me with all you do in your community, and the impact that you're having will be innumerable and just invaluable to your community and beyond. So thank you so much for all of your work in this area and beyond, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica.
Okay.